Hello and welcome to this podcast episode. Today I have the distinct pleasure of actually sitting with to speak with David Newman. And David, I'm going to mostly let you tell your own story. You've been a kirtan musician, a yoga teacher, and before that you studied law. So maybe I'm just going to ask you to start by telling us a little bit about that transition from studying law to opening a yoga studio and eventually to kirtan.
Sure. Well, I was living in, I'll go back a little bit further, and it's nice to be here, Jeff. So
thank you, David.
Yeah,
Thank you for doing this.
Right on. Thanks for having me. Going back a little further, just to sort of complete the story, the circuitous journey of my life. After college, I studied music, and actually I was pre-med in college and was thinking about being a doctor, but after college I decided to move to Los Angeles and pursue a career in music. And that was back in, 1987. And I lived in California for a couple of years and became a bit disenchanted with the music industry and thought, how could I impact others? And so I considered exploring a career in law. So I moved to New York City in 1990 and enrolled at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in the West Village, and graduated a couple years later, took the bar exam. But while I was in law school, I think to cope with law school, and I got very impassioned with yoga. I had been meditating and practicing yoga for some time, but during law school, I just fell in love with the practice and split my time in New York City between studying to be a lawyer and practicing yoga. Those are my two main endeavors. So there was part of me that felt that perhaps I wanted to explore, rather than a career in law, I wanted to be a yoga teacher. But back in the early 1990s, that hadn't sprouted yet. I was living in New York City, so you had Jivamukti and a few other yoga centers. But then after law school, I moved back to Philadelphia, and there was really nothing happening. Maybe somebody teaching in their homes, or someone was teaching in the basement of a New Age bookstore at a store called Garland of Letters,
right
on South Street. But there wasn't really much happening, so I thought, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to open a yoga center in Philadelphia? So I took the bar exam in August of 1992, and right about that time I was walking in a little town called Manayunk, and I looked up and I saw a for rent sign. So I called the number, met the person there, went up to the second floor, and it was an empty room with windows all the way around and high ceilings, and I just saw a yoga center in my mind. So in October, 2 months later, I opened Yoga on Main in Philadelphia. I figured, maybe I'll get it out of my system and then I'll take a real job, But I just, interestingly enough, Jeff, just this last week visited the new Yoga on Main. It just was sold. I had given it to my partner, and then he sold it this year. They moved 2 blocks away on the same street. And I went and saw the new space and met the new owners, and we had tea, and that's 27 years ago.
Well, so I was there 2 years ago for a talk, but that would have been the original location?
That was the original location,
okay.
Yeah.
So it's moved since then?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
It moved literally, I think, just like 3 months ago.
Oh my God.
So it was in the same location for 27 years.
And that was literally the first yoga studio in Philly?
Pretty much. I didn't scour the streets, but, as far as I recollect, aside from people, again, teaching out of their homes, there was no dedicated yoga center at that time.
Okay.
Now in Philadelphia, there's just numerous.
Sure,
I
they're
probably
all over
couldn't
the place.
even count them. Yeah.
Right. So what was that like? So here you are, you're into yoga, you're opening essentially the first yoga studio. How did people find you? What was the reception? What was the energy around the opening?
It was completely effortless, and build it and they will come. That was it. I remember going into a restaurant next to the yoga center, meeting the father of my high school girlfriend. Said, "Hey, David, what are you doing these days?" I said, "Well, I'm opening a yoga center in about 2 weeks." And he said, "Oh, that'll never work." And but there was the need, and there was the demand. And for me, you know, personally speaking, when I opened the doors of the yoga center, you know, I would say, you know, class at 7 p.m. tonight, and the door would be unlocked, and I would be there, and nobody would come. And then, you know, a week later, there would be one person, and then 3 people, and then I remember. So that was October. By the holidays, the Tuesday night class and the Saturday and Sunday morning classes were up to like 20, 25 people. Mm. And I had personally felt like, oh, I finally found my reason for being. It just felt like an absolute natural self-expression to be teaching yoga. And it just unfolded and evolved from there.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Just right time, right place.
And so how long did you run the center?
The new owners were asking me that the other day. I kind of have to speculate a little bit because you know how time is in
Sure.
the past, kind of all fades. I was solidly running this center and teaching yoga for about 10 years. And then what happened for me was I had a reawakening to my musical self, and I started writing songs, and I met a record producer, recorded my first album. I went to Los Angeles and got back into music, but more devotionally, spiritually, and of course, as you mentioned, working with kirtan and mantras. Having the yoga center, I got to invite people like Krishna Das and Jai Uttal and Bhagavan Das and other folks who were bringing a Western flavor to this ancient Sanskrit, you know, mantra practice called kirtan. So I started chanting and I started writing songs, and back in, I think it was 2001, I went to Los Angeles and recorded my first album. And then my second album, which came out, I believe it was in 2005, called Lotus Feet. That was interesting for me, and it was a funny story because I listen to NPR all the time these days. I enjoy it. But back then, I literally never listened to NPR. It was like not on my radar at all. And I was at an ashram in Taos, New Mexico, the Neem Karoli Baba Hanuman temple. Mm-hmm. And I just started sharing my music and my kirtan, like, you know, in Washington, D.C. and in New York City, and just sort of moving out a little bit from Philadelphia. And I got a call at the ashram from a woman who was a music reviewer for a show called All Things Considered, and I didn't think twice about it. She said, "May I review your CD on that show?" And I said, "Sure." We set up an interview and did the interview. It came out, and next thing I knew, people were calling me from all over the country. You know, I heard, "Are you the David Newman?" or "Is this your album?" And I remember going on my website like the next morning, and there was like 500 orders for my CD. And that was sort of like the defining shift for me. And you know, I sort of what it was I was teaching yoga and running a yoga center 100% of the time, and then like 80% of the time and doing my music 20%, and then the yoga part kept dwindling, and eventually the music took over. And probably by about like 2007, 2008, I fully shifted to a career in music and sharing kirtan and chanting and traveling, doing that.
Right. And so you have also used the name Durga Das in certain circles.
Sure.
When did that happen?
I was touring and studying with a kirtan wala named Bhagavan Das, who he was a devotee of Neem Karoli Baba, and he was the one who had introduced Ram Das to Neem Karoli Baba when he was like 17 years old. And so Bhagavan Das was, I traveled and studied with him, and he gave me the name Durga Das. I always, Das means servant. So, if you're Krishna Das, you're servant of Krishna. If you're, Ram Das, servant of Ram. Durga Das, servant of the Divine Mother. I've always felt drawn to the feminine aspect of, the beloved. Yeah.
I see. So Bhagavan Das gave you that name.
That's right.
And you were touring with him.
I was traveling with him.
You were traveling with him.
Yeah, not all the time, but whenever I could. I had other responsibilities, but whenever I could, I went on the road with him.
Okay. Did you study with other kirtan singers?
Yeah, I spent time with all of them, and also time in India as well, working with different teachers and different kirtan singers. And I also studied Vedic chanting as part. My original yogic training was in the lineage of Krishnamacharya and Desigachar.
Okay.
Krishnamacharya was Patabi Joyce and he taught Patabi Joyce, and who's the other teacher that he taught? Desigachar and Iyengar. And part of that lineage, a big part of it was Vedic chanting, which is different than kirtan, but I studied Sanskrit and Vedic chanting in that lineage.
I see. And was that in India or here?
Both.
Or both. Okay.
Both. Desigachar, who passed, had a disciple who lived in Maryland named Sonia Nelson. She is now the Vedic Studies Center in New Mexico, and I studied with Sonia. And also, the yoga teacher who inspired me when I was in law school in New York City was Gary Krafsow, and he was living in Maui but came to New York to teach, and he also taught Vedic chanting as well.
I see.
Yeah.
Now you've mentioned Neem Karoli Baba,
Yeah, sure.
who was the guru that Ram Dass met. So and really, Ram Dass brought his name to a much wider
He sure did.
circle for sure. And Bhagavan Das had been a young
Sadhu.
and had met Ram Dass in India and brought him to see Neem Karoli. And I know you have a story around Neem Karoli.
Sure.
And before you get to the story, do you consider Neem Karoli to be your guru or your teacher?
The answer is yes. And that said, it's such a sort of refined inner connection, and I never met him on the physical plane.
Right.
But I do consider him to be my guru or my spiritual guide, for sure. And the reason I entered into music and kirtan was really because of that relationship and his grace.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. The meeting of Neem Karoli Baba that you had was after Neem Karoli was no longer alive.
That's right. And Neem Karoli Baba, as my travels have gone on, over the years, I've met so many people who've shared similar stories. And he's very active, even though he's no longer alive. And he came to me in several meditations and dreams. And in one dream in particular, he came to me, and I was going through a stressful time in my life, and it was maybe a few years into being a yoga teacher. I came from a professional family. My mother was a Supreme Court Justice of Pennsylvania. My father was a surgeon. And although I loved teaching yoga, I somehow felt like I felt a sense of inadequacy about it. Like maybe I should go back to practicing law. Maybe I should do this, or maybe I'm throwing away my life being a yoga teacher. And so I felt a little conflicted, and so one night I prayed to Neem Karoli Baba, also known as Maharaji, to help guide me and in my dreams. And he did that night. And I told him how I was feeling and what my conflict was and what my struggle was. And he said to me in the dream, "Bolo, bolo." And this was before I had gotten back into music. He had bolo, bolo, which means sing. And as soon as he said that to me, I woke up and just got the message. A part of me thought, wow, this is a great saint, and, this is all he's got. I was looking for some real guidance, so to speak. But that part of me, that the deeper part of me, was received the message in a kind of an energetic way, in a deeper way. And the next day I went and bought a new guitar, and the songs just started coming. Okay. And that was the beginning of my... I love using the words kirtan career, juxtaposed, because, they don't really fit together. But
absolutely.
That was the beginning of my music or kirtan career, was that dream. And there were many other ways in which Neem Karoli Baba came into my life and the inner planes, and took me on a whole new path. And the path was, I remember at that time also thinking that I loved Hatha Yoga and practicing asana, it was my primary practice, but there was something inside me that was yearning for more. And I really, until that dream and until I started chanting more and devoting myself to expressing myself through kirtan and through music, that led me to Bhakti Yoga. And that's what I was looking for, but I didn't know it at the time.
Right, because Neem Karoli, as we said, Bhagavan Das was with Neem Karoli Ram Das. They weren't necessarily yoga teachers.
No, none of them were.
And Krishna Das, another well-known kirtan singer, also is in that lineage, and as far as I know, is also not a yoga
That's correct.
teacher. So that wasn't necessarily Neem Karoli's path. His path was a bhakti path.
His path was bhakti path, and when people would come to Neem Karoli Baba and ask him for spiritual guidance, his stock answer was, feed people and serve people.
Right.
That was his teaching. But yet he realized that one's true capacity to serve was by seeing the divine in the other. That's how the motivation stemmed from the vision of seeing the beloved in the other.
Right.
And so for him, singing kirtan was the vehicle through which, especially the Westerners who weren't conditioned to have devotion,
right.
could find it through the chanting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So great. This is kind of where I wanted to get to, which is because for certainly the time you were in your kirtan career and probably beyond, but Bhakti Yoga was the center of your path.
Absolutely.
And so can you tell us how you understand Bhakti Yoga as a path?
Sure. Well, the word bhakti means devotional or unconditional love. So Bhakti Yoga is the practice of devotional or unconditional love as a yoga, both as a present moment practice to express love for the other, and also to attain the goal of spiritual union of yoga. And bhakti practice centers around kirtan, centers around chanting mantras, but there's also other aspects to the path like puja or ritualistic offering, often traditionally also having a guru, expressing one's devotion to a higher power through a vehicle.
Right,
through a form. So loving the divine in form,
right.
so to speak.
So you're loving the divine. The form could be ritual.
Right.
The form could be kirtan or
Right.
chanting.
Could be service.
Could be service.
Sure.
Feed people.
Yeah.
Right. It could be devotion to a teacher, to a guru.
Exactly.
I see. And so for you, what was it?
For me, it was a couple things. One, it was my inner relationship with Neem Karoli Baba. There is a phrase in Sanskrit which is called Ishta Devata, which means one's chosen form of the beloved, meaning in Bhakti in particular, the whole practice of Bhakti is to see the beloved in everything. That's the ultimate practice. Bhakti also does recommend finding a particular form that speaks to your heart as a means to seeing the beloved in everything, to go through a particular form. So the beauty of Bhakti is that it doesn't prescribe a particular form. Everybody worship this or
right.
him or her. And a lot of what Bhakti is finding your Ishta Devata, what form speaks to your heart. And for me, it was and continues to be that inner relationship with Neem Karoli Baba. And for me, it's been a very kind of nuanced practice. Ultimately, it translated in more of what they call a bhakti bhav, and that is sort of a capacity to see the beloved, in everyone. And that's why through traveling for, it's been over 15 years and singing kirtan, and sharing that exchange of heart with so many souls. That was a big part of my practice, was just tirelessly traveling around the world.
Right.
It was my passion. It was my sadhana. It was my vocation. I mean, I say was only because I've cut back a bit, but it still is.
Yes.
Is my vocation, my passion and my sadhana as well. and my service to others. So to me, the ultimate practice of Bhakti Yoga is appreciation for one's life and love for the beloved in all interactions. I think it's like any other path, like a Buddhist, like practicing, compassion and love.
So really, the deepest core of your practice is your relationship with Neem Karoli.
That is it, but that has changed through the years, because in earlier times for me, it was being in relationship to his form, and now it's more. It's more of emerging for me. I feel the bhakti, the devotional love, unconditional love, is a presence that's always available. It doesn't belong to a person, so it doesn't belong to Neem Karoli Baba solely. So it's present in every moment.
Sure.
So to me now, it's being in an intimate relationship with that love. It's less than being in a relationship with Neem Karoli Baba's form. It's more being in relationship to the essence, which is Neem Karoli Baba, which is also the essence within you and the essence within me. So it's being in close proximity and staying close to that. And by the way, and over time you get a sense when you're drifting.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking traditionally the role of the guru is to personify the goal.
Absolutely.
Because it's easier in the beginning to have a focal point to focus on, but over time that which the guru represents is what you want to be devoted to, not.
And the goal of the guru is to make him or herself obsolete for that which is embodied within him or her to then to be realized within the disciple's consciousness.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So what you're describing is the way the path is supposed to work.
Sure.
Working with a teacher.
Exactly. But then there's this reverence, for the form. It's different. It's more of a reverence.
Sure.
As opposed to a desperate need to be close to the form.
Right.
It's a reverence for the form. Thank you for taking me here. And let me share you with others.
Yes.
Who may be so inclined. But I've never felt like I needed to impose Neem Karoli Baba's on other beings, because for me as a bhakti facilitator, my goal is to facilitate somebody's passion to express devotion and to find the form in which that will take them home, so to speak. And that's been the real joy for me, is just through my music and through the chanting with others and through sharing the teachings of bhakti as they come through me, to connect people with their own sense of bhakti and their own sense of devotion, and just see where that takes them.
Beautiful.
And it's unique for everybody. And that's the beauty of it.
That's fantastic.
It's not a prescription.
Right.
It's a discovery.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you obviously that's been your path for a long time, and you've been faithful to it, and you still practice it. So,
sure.
So clearly along the way you must have had spiritual experiences that opened you to deeper and higher levels.
Absolutely.
I would be curious to hear about a few, in the sense of what kinds of openings did you have, and therefore could one potentially have on a bhakti path? What sorts of experiences does one find?
So many. Some are major fireworks, and some are more subtle. And the subtle ones happen throughout the course of every single day. The big shifts in consciousness for me I could count them on one hand, if that. I'll share a couple of those with you. And the first one is connected to Neem Karoli Baba, because Neem Karoli Baba initially came to me, didn't come to me initially, but came to me, like entered into me through a painting that was painted for me. I had moved into a new apartment, and my sister-in-law, as a housewarming gift, painted this magnificent oil painting of Neem Karoli Baba for my living room. And I was meditating one night before Neem Karoli Baba was my guru, and I was staring at the painting. And it's funny, I tell people now when they see his image that I bring with me at kirtans, if he starts to talk to you, it's don't come looking for me. But nonetheless, he came through that painting to me, and I received an inner message, and that was that I manifested this painting for you because I want to be this big in your life. And that was my bhakti opening. I mean, in that moment, whoever he is, which is still a great mystery to all of us, just reflected back to me my nature as love. And I broke into tears. Almost, I couldn't hardly stop them. But they weren't negative. They were bhakti tears. They were just tears of love. And that moment was my initiation.
Beautiful.
That was my initiation into bhakti, and everything changed after that. Then later, the second big shift in consciousness I had was many years later, was in 2010. And you and I have spoken about this. I wrote about it in my book, The Time-Bound Traveler. Whereas the Neem Karoli Baba, when grace came in that moment, it was so beautiful, and it was so, the tears were just because the joy was beyond comprehension. I could hardly contain it within my body. It was like, it was just a, it was like a long lost self-remembering of something I didn't even know I was until that moment. But in 2010, I had a non-dual shift in consciousness where I perceived reality, and everything was there in it but for me as the perceiver. So that was, rather than being a joyful expansion, that was led to a dark night of the soul, and that was more of a terrifying shift for me. 3 years. It took me 3 years to process that one moment. It happened, actually, I woke up in the middle of the night, walked into the next room, and there it was, everything as it was without me. And I beheld my own non-existence in that moment. And as a bhakta, my path was always sort of centered around me as the lover expressing my devotion for the beloved. So this duality kind of was also not only my reality, but it was also the bedrock of my devotional spiritual practice. Right. So suddenly when that came out, and there was no David Newman, and there was no Neem Karoli, there was no one to love the beloved, it completely shook the earth below me, and sent me into a very, very difficult journey for 3 years, which led me to a spiritual awakening, where I was, for lack of a better description, able to ultimately relax into my own non-existence as a separate entity.
Right, and I first met you probably fairly shortly after that fruition of that experience.
That was 2013, I think.
I think so,
fruition of that was. When did you move into town?
I moved here about 2013. I probably met you about a year later.
Right.
And you we talked about this. As you said, I'd gotten a copy of your book, which I don't remember. What's the title?
The Time-Bound Traveler.
Time-Bound Traveler.
Yeah.
And so you were sort of out of the dark night part of that.
Right.
At that
I
point.
had that, that break, that opening, that, yeah.
The second opening. Can you describe that to us?
It was a non-experience. It was I was simply walking down the street, and suddenly the realization of everything that I aspired to and feared both at the same time fell away. And the realization was that there was no me to find it. It just fell away. The burden of seeking fell away, and suddenly it was just, this is it.
Right.
There is no aspiration. There is no attainment. There is no fear. There is no. I remember for that year being so articulate in terms of describing that moment, and now it's so sort of commonplace in my being that I have to jog my memory to bring myself back there, because to me, when I was in the throes of wanting to awaken, it was a pursuit. Right. And then when I woke up, the realization was you don't awaken because you're never not awake. So I didn't actually awaken.
Right.
The whole enterprise just ceased to be, as if it never had existed. And so it was, whereas those other awakenings were these big moments in my life, this was recognized by the absence of what was there in its place.
Right.
But there was no new path that was revealed. It was kind of the end of something.
Right. It was kind of the end of seeking.
It was definitely the end of seeking for me. Yeah.
Right.
And it's never occurred to me to seek since.
Right. Now that's very fascinating, because I know when we were speaking about it, part of what you were contemplating was because what you're describing as a non-dual awakening would be classically more described in Jnana yoga, right? The yoga of wisdom and insight, which is where you have the insight that there's only one, and that you are that. David never existed. There just is what is, and that's all. And so you were questioning the difference between a bhakti path, in which there's a distinct, and I've read that supposedly some great bhaktis will renounce their non-dual awakening because they want to stay in.
They don't want to be there, as Ramakrishna said. They don't want to be the sugar. They want to taste the sugar.
Mm-hmm. Right, which is in some bhakti traditions is considered a higher attainment.
That's true.
So who knows, a higher or lower. But how do you see that now in terms of the bhakti path and the jnana path, the kinds of realizations you had when you were more consciously a bhakti versus this later experience?
Sure. To me now, there really is no difference between the two. They're two sides of the same coin, and not even separate sides.
Right.
I know many people who have sort of treaded the Gyan path, and then Bhakti has revealed itself to them. For me, it was Bhakti, and then the Gyan, the Advaita came in. It was not consciously invited by me, I can tell you that. That's why it was so devastating. It wasn't what I was aspiring to have, a non-dual awakening. As a matter of fact, when it happened, I didn't even know what it was.
Right.
And then I had to find out, through finding people that could, help reflect back to me what had taken place in my consciousness. So to me, and also when I had that non-dual awakening, when it bared fruit in 2013, I didn't even know if I would even be interested in singing kirtan anymore or expressing my bhakti. And ultimately, the way I look at it now, if I would be called upon to conceptualize it, which I typically don't gravitate toward, but if I was, which I am,
which you are,
which I am, I would say something like this: that there is. The disintegration of the idea of a me has given rise, interestingly enough, to a greater sense of passionate engaging in embodiment and in the duality. I look at it as, to the degree that it is an illusion, to the degree that duality doesn't really exist, but I'm still in it, I choose for it to be a beautiful dream rather than a nightmare.
Right.
Yeah, I just do, and so for me, my nature as an individualized entity, so to speak, tends to gravitate toward bhakti.
Right.
It's my nature.
Right.
So in the same way that a rose seed grows into a rose, or a tulip seed grows into a tulip, the David seed tends to gravitate toward musical self-expression and bhakti.
Right.
And so I continue because that's my nature. But I don't continue prior to that. Singing kirtan and being a bhakti yoga practitioner, there was something I was striving towards. So it had I would say it was laced with a sense of desperation. I'll practice every morning and I'll get somewhere. I'll keep singing and this will lead me to. So I don't have that anymore. So the reason why I chant is because I enjoy it.
Right.
It's really that simple. I just enjoy it. And, and if I never did it again, that would be fine too.
Right.
I mean, I used to sing and chant, and as soon as I was done, I had to get to the next kirtan. I was like compelled to do it.
Right.
So now, when I'm not doing it, I'm not really thinking about it. But when I'm doing it, I'm enjoying it. And it's in the moment when I'm chanting and playing and singing, especially with others. it's deeply rich for me.
Right.
It's as rich and wonderful and satisfying or more than it's ever been.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So you and I have a very interesting parallel. I mean, I've always, ever since I met you, I've kind of known that we have this sort of parallel. It's interestingly parallel and different.
Right.
Right? It's sort of parallel and opposite in some ways. But because I didn't really consider myself a bhakti. Before I say that, I would just want to say, and I don't know if you may already know this, but Ramana Maharshi in one of his passages says that, and Ramana is a great non-dual teacher of the 20th century, but he says in the end, someone asked, what's the difference between Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga? And he said, in the end, they're the same.
Right.
Because he said any Jnana Yoga who's discovering the true self has to fall in love with it.
Right.
Right?
That's beautiful.
And any Bhakti Yoga who's loving God has to discover that they are that which they love.
Right.
So in the end, they sort of merge.
Absolutely.
And there's no distinction, which is what you're describing.
Yeah.
And for myself, I lived in a spiritual community and did a lot of meditation practice. And had a very similar end point, after many, many experiences and blah, blah, all these things that happened. But the end point was sitting in yet another, 18, 19 years later, another 10-day retreat, ready to go for it, and the first bell rang. And the thought was, oh my God, I just don't have the energy. Like I can't do it again. And I thought at first, oh no, that's bad. That was my first response. I gave up. But the second thing I realized was I don't need to be convinced anymore.
Right.
There's nothing left. I don't need another experience. I don't care anymore about having an experience because nothing that could possibly happen was going to make me more convinced about the existence of the divine than I already was.
It is a giving up in a sense.
Yeah,
There's
an
aspect of just giving it up.
It's a giving up, and you seem to have to go through whatever you have to go through to get to the point where there's a giving up.
And isn't it a great mystery, and I want to hear the rest of this, a great mystery, what takes a person to that moment?
Absolutely.
I've never figured that out.
And it seems to be different for everybody,
everyone,
But yeah, so there's this kind of giving up, and like you were thinking, well, I don't know if I'm going to want to sing kirtan anymore. And I was thinking, I don't know if I'm going to want to meditate anymore. I mean, I didn't meditate for a while.
Sure.
But then I came back to it because I like it. I enjoy doing it. And also it really became for me an opportunity to worship. Because I felt like whatever the divine is, one way that I can express my total love and devotion is to be completely vulnerable.
Right.
Is to just sit and do nothing. Because I know, he or she will take care of everything.
Right.
That I want to prove or show or demonstrate.
That's beautiful.
That I'm not concerned anymore about myself.
Just total bhakti.
It's total, right. Total bhakti.
Yeah, total trust.
I now know
Ishvara Pranidhana, faith in the divine.
Right. I know that you're taking care of me, and I don't need to do anything but sit here.
Yeah.
And so I feel my meditation practice has become, where it used to be like me trying to see through my mind.
Right.
It now becomes just
an offering
to the divine, and that's
beautiful.
That's and then as I've looked back, my path was kind of always a mix because of course I was doing a lot of practice, but I was working with a teacher whom I loved more than I ever knew you could love someone.
Sure.
And so that was always interwoven through the path. But I think it's powerful to see that that there are two distinct paths, right? The bhakti, the actual path of consciously loving, learning to love the divine, and the more jnani path of turning inward to the mysteries of the unknown.
Right.
Right. They are very distinctly different, and they do attract people differently.
They do.
Right? Some people really gravitate toward one, others really gravitate toward the other. But to see, in at least both of our cases, this merging point where they sort of become indistinguishable.
I love the story about the great Advaita saint Shankara, who toward the end of his life spent most of his time writing devotional love songs to Durga.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. So yeah, I guess this has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks, Jeff.
And I really wanted to flesh out the bhakti path because it's not something I teach much. I don't,
I'm sure it comes through in your nature.
Exactly.
And,
in a certain
sure.
essence, it comes through, but it's not actually something I know much about.
Sure.
And I don't have any, I haven't been on a bhakti path. I've sung kirtan with you a couple of times, and a few other times, but not often.
Well, I think, the converse is true. I think you hold that bhakti. You're an open-hearted person, and it sounds from what you're saying, your orientation and your practice is surrender toward loving the divine, and you had a guru who you love very much. So although your path is more oriented toward meditation and self-inquiry, it's laced with your devotional inner world. In the same way, when I had my non-dual awakening, I started teaching about, sharing, and I found that the people who gravitated toward me, maybe 3% of them even cared about that shift in consciousness, and they were there to connect to my bhakti nature.
Right.
And so for me, I'm a bhakti teacher, but it's conversely laced with that non-dual awareness that I bring into it, although it's not the front page. It's just in there.
Right. And yes, exactly. This is the interesting parallel that we have with each other, that's parallel and opposite at the same time.
Exactly. So, that's beautiful.
David, it's been a real joy
to
Jeff. Speak with you, and I hope we get to do this again.
I hope so too. Thanks for having me on.
You are very welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.